This adventure begins with friendship. Now, we all meet people through our lives that I consider buddies, pals, or acquaintances. However, there are seldom few I refer to as a friend. Someone who, in the dead of winter storm, agrees to help cut and lay tile for mere pizza and beer. Someone who not only agrees to help you move, but drives 2.5 hours for it. Basically, pure selflessness. When someone of this caliber asks me for something, I try to accommodate them as they would do the same in return. So once again, I start this adventure with a wholehearted friendship. This friend's name is John. So here's a bit of a backstory. John and I were neighbors within 2 miles of each other. We lived in the same subdivision, would frequently hang out and volunteer ourselves for whatever the other one was doing to renovate their house. Long story short, John moved out of the subdivision south about 500 miles, and then I moved out shortly after. John purchased the house not too long after the move and asked me if I wouldn't mind building him a table to furnish his dining room. Now, John and his wife wanted a pedestal table. Not having the tools or the know-how to make a solid oak pedestal, I deferred John to purchase them elsewhere. I have to give a shout out to Hanson Wood Turning, located in Maine, as they did a phenomenal job on the table base and the customer service was amazing. Really, all we needed to do was open the box and start staining, which is what we're doing here. Building the lumber was a bit problematic, as the size and weight of the lumber was a bit cumbersome. My 8-inch joiner was maxed out in both width and length, so I took my time face joining and tried not to lose any fingers in the process while I was manhandling the lumber. Edge joining was not as difficult as face joining, however trying to hold the board to the fence while making sure it sat flat on the outfeet table was pretty exhausting. This was a real arm workout, but I knew I needed to be careful as any deviations here would lead to noticeable gaps in my joints. One good technique I picked up is from Michael Pekovic from Fine Woodworking. He teaches to joint the edges on opposite faces if possible. This way, if your joiner is a bit off of 90 degrees, then joining the board in the opposite of face allows those two adjacent joints, when put together, to equal 90 degrees. I'll link the info about this in the notes for the video if you're still confused, as it's a bit hard to explain with just words. Next step was the thickness planing. This wasn't too difficult, as the only problem I needed to watch out for was the snipe at the end of the board. This sometimes can be caused by the weight of the board as it exits the planer, as it wants to pull closer to the blades. I put a roller at the end, but sometimes you still have to watch out for snipe. I like making these stands for my tabletop glue-ups. They take care of some of the clearance issues you have when dealing with a glue-up with a ton of clamps. These easy-to-make stands allow for long clamp placement for preparation, as well as allowing for clearance for the small clamps that are at the end joints near the end of the boards. I like to see how everything's going to look when glued up before finding something I don't like when it's too late. Things like grain, joint gaps, blemishes, etc. In addition, I like to go through the process on a dry run before gluing anything up. This is a great way to find out if, say, you're missing a clamp or a block somewhere before glue starts drying. For example, I found out here that small clamps weren't going to work with the stands on the floor because of clearance, which required me to move the table up on my trusty plastic workbench. I find gluing up these big projects like a table can be super stressful. It doesn't take more than a couple of minutes to totally screw with you mentally. So call me prepared, but I like to go through everything in my head first, like a general at war, before battling it out with time working against me. So what I like to do is take the edges that are going to be glued and face them up. Put all my clamps where they're going to be needed. Place joint blocks where I'm going to need them. Think about the plan in depth, practice gluing them up, and then execute. And here we go. I like using the bent finger technique to do all my tabletop glue-ups. To quickly explain, you hold the glue in one hand and follow it slightly with the bent finger. This allows you to dictate how much glue is in the middle of the joint versus at the edges, as it depends on how bent your finger is. It's actually a pretty easy technique once you learn it, and is fast and doesn't require any tools. I'm still a rookie, so my technique is considered acceptable. As always, you can see my wife is cleaning up after me. Now, I've done a couple tabletop glue-ups, and I don't use any biscuits to keep the boards together. It seems like all the literature I read tend to never use biscuits. I'm guessing it's because if you took the time to mill the boards right, there's no need to keep the boards even. I also like these mounts. It keeps everything as flat as possible with space underneath it. I use clamping cauls to keep my boards aligned during dry time. I have about 4 sizes of clamping cauls, from big to small, and I use them for all sorts of multi-board glue-ups, like nightstands and coffee tables to tabletops and cutting boards. They're actually really easy to make on the joiner, and I'll actually go over this in another video. It's time to start loading the clamping power. From big tabletop clips, you can never have too many clamps. My strategy when using clamping cauls is to start at the center, then work your way outwards, alternating clamps from top to bottom. Once I get to the end, I then add end clamps with blocks to minimize misalignment at the end joints. Just a note here on clamping cauls, make sure you use packing tape on the side of the caul which touches the glue, as having a tabletop with cauls glued to it is not very user-friendly nor attractive. After the glue is dried, it's time to start the flattening process. Removing all the glue is kind of a pain, and there's no really easy way to do it, but here's my process. I initially card scrape what I can, and then for big glue lines, I use a chisel and lightly push it across the glue line. As you can see here, I'm barely using any force, and the glue kind of pops off the wood. I'm not too worried about light gouges from the chisel, as they will be removed during the later flattening processes. After all the major glue is gone, I then go back over the joints with a card scraper again. This is to make sure that most of the joints are even enough for hand planing. You know your card scrape is sharp when you can make these awesome looking shavings from it. The card scraper is such a simple device, a sheet of metal hooked on one side, but it's so effective and it excels at smoothing against the grain. Now for big differences between the joint, I use a low angle block plane to try to flatten one side enough for the jack plane to go across it. Now here comes the workout. Flattening a tabletop by hand is quite the sweat maker. However, I don't have a 40-inch belt sander to put this through, so to the jack plane it is. The next time you look at a piece of antique furniture, just think that this was all done by the sweat and hard work of the early day woodworkers. Hand planing a tabletop will have you better appreciate the effort. That's all I'm saying. Okay, back to hand planing. I use a jack plane here because I don't have a scrub plane, which is for moving a crap ton of wood easier and faster. So when you don't have a scrub plane, you use a jack plane. The technique is pretty simple. Plane from one corner at a 45-degree angle, then come back to the opposite corner, crisscrossing with a 45-degree going the other direction. As you can see, I'm planing at a 45-degree across the whole top and across every joint. During this state of flattening, the goal here is to get your board in a somewhat rough state of flatness. Basically, we want to remove any high spots and get the top as flat as we can, but to not worry about appearances. After this process of against the grain planing, your top will look like one of Jason's victims from the Friday the 13th films. But don't worry. We'll come back and smooth everything out and get the top to look sexy again. Now in order to check progress, I use some winding sticks to make sure I don't start unflattening the top. I check about every 2 passes with the jack plane. Now since this top was milled and glued up right, we have greatly minimized the work needed to flatten and check all the time. Now on to the smoothing plane, my trusted number 3 Stanley. After you have established a flat enough top, then the next step is to take that beast and make it into a beauty. Starting at one end, just work your way across the top with the grain this time. The goal here is to remove any damage that the jack plane did by going against the grain in the last step. By the end of this process, your top should look like it was just removed from the machine planer and ready to be sanded. Now on to squaring off the ends. I use a simple jig here which works like a track saw but doesn't cost an arm and a leg. I square the jig up using a carpenter square, then cut it using my circular saw.